On April 12, 1933, the roar of the BMW engine filled the small airfield outside Munich, vibrating through the soles of Hans Baur's boots as he ran his hand along the sleek fuselage of the Focke-Wulf FW-44. The young pilot's eyes were steady, but his mind raced. Above him, the sky was the same pale blue it had been every morning since he had been assigned to the man who would come to define a nation. Adolf Hitler was waiting, and as always, there was an unspoken weight in every glance, every order. It was not just a flight. It was a test of loyalty, courage, and the fragile barrier between life and death. Hans remembered the first time he saw him close. The man in the crisp uniform, the small mustache, the eyes that flickered with intensity. Everyone else bowed, saluted, or scurried away. But in the cockpit, there was no grandeur, no audience. There was only Hans, the controls, and the Führer. He learned quickly that in those moments, the slightest misstep could ripple far beyond the metal hull. One wrong calculation, one misjudged maneuver, and the history of Europe could pivot on a single catastrophic error. Flying Hitler was an exercise in observation as much as skill. Baur could sense the smallest tremor in his hand, the subtle shift in posture that betrayed mood or intent. There were days when the man's speeches seemed almost unbearable, a blur of rhetoric and fevered nationalism. But in the air, he became vulnerable in a way no one saw. Baur watched him scan maps, whisper to aides, sometimes hum under his breath, lost in thoughts that seemed both mundane and monumental. In those hours above forests and rivers, Hans became the quiet guardian of a regime built on terror. The work demanded more than courage, it demanded silence. In the early years, when Hitler traveled to inspect the newly strengthened Luftwaffe or attend rallies, Baur carried more than a passenger. He carried secrets. Whispers of political purges, murmurs of foreign intrigue, glimpses of paranoia that only those closest could perceive. Baur did not judge. He only observed and obeyed. Each takeoff was an act of trust, each landing a confirmation of that trust. The cockpit was more than a space. It was a crucible of loyalty, where the line between duty and complicity blurred beneath the steady hum of the engine. War brought chaos, and with chaos came danger. As the years passed, Baur navigated skies thick with anti-aircraft fire, narrow escapes across storm-tossed Alps, and tense negotiations with generals who distrusted their own shadows. In 1944, when the bombs fell closer to Berlin and whispers of plots against the Führer reached fever pitch, Baur's hand never wavered on the controls. Every flight could be his last, yet he remained, a witness to history in its most intimate and perilous moments. He saw the fear behind the speeches, the meticulous planning behind the madness, and the haunting weight of decisions that could annihilate millions. And then came the final days, April 1945. The Reich crumbling under the relentless advance of Soviet forces, the air thick with smoke, ash, and despair. Baur stood outside the Führer bunker, a man weathered by years of flight and fear, and watched as the world he had helped ferry to destruction began to collapse. Hitler, ever obsessed with control even as the walls closed in, still demanded flights, still insisted on orders that could no longer be obeyed. Baur ferried him from one precarious location to another, each journey shorter, each sky darker. The cockpit remained a silent witness, carrying the echo of 1,000 decisions, each one inching humanity closer to catastrophe. When the war ended, and the Reich lay in ruin, Hans Baur survived. Captured, questioned, and ultimately released. He carried with him stories no one dared to fully hear, truths about the man who had commanded armies and inspired devotion, and yet depended on a single pilot to ferry him safely from danger. In interviews years later, Baur spoke with measured calm, recounting flights, conversations, and fleeting moments of vulnerability, painting a portrait not of a godlike leader, but of a man whose destiny had always been tethered to others' hands. It was a strange power. Hans realized the power of proximity. He had not commanded armies, nor issued decrees, nor shaped the course of policy. But in the small, enclosed space of the cockpit, he had held the life of one of history's most infamous men in his hands. Ordinary loyalty had become an extraordinary responsibility, a quiet complicity that carried consequences beyond comprehension. And as he recounted those flights decades later, it was clear. To witness evil at its zenith was to understand that sometimes history is shaped not only by those who seize power, but by those who safeguard it, even unwillingly. The sky had always been his domain, but now it carried memory, burdened with the knowledge that for 16 years, a man like Hitler had flown within reach of his hands, and survived because someone else bore the risk. And in that realization, Hans Baur understood the terrible intimacy of being closest to power. On May 7th, Hitler hated the sky. It was an irrational fear, yet it clung to him like a shadow. He would pace the tarmac before each flight, eyes scanning the horizon as if the clouds themselves were conspirators. Storm clouds made him restless, turbulence made him pale, and every distant rumble of thunder seemed to echo the threat of a world conspiring against him. And yet, above all others, he trusted Hans Baur. It was a trust forged not in words but in repeated flights where one man's hands had kept him alive when fate seemed poised to intervene. Baur remembered those early days, when the Nazi Party was still a rising storm rather than the force it would become. Each flight to rallies in Nuremberg or Munich was more than a journey. It was a passage through history in motion. Hitler clutched maps, muttering through rehearsed speeches and last-minute directives, while Baur navigated a world of ever-shifting air currents, narrow landing strips, and the relentless watch of political enemies. In the cockpit, there was no audience to cheer or jeer, only the hum of the engine and the invisible tension that tethered life to skill. Their first cross-country flights were as much about psychology as logistics. Hitler's fear of flying made him insistent on precise altitudes and cautious maneuvers. Yet, as Baur guided the aircraft, he noticed that the man's trembling fingers would sometimes relax when reassured by a calm word or a slight nod. "Trust your pilot," Baur would say quietly, though not always aloud, and Hitler would adjust the strap of his goggles and nod, as if acknowledging a fragile but vital truth, that in this world, loyalty could transcend fear. Through the early Nazi years, Baur became more than a pilot. He became a silent witness to the consolidation of power. He watched Hitler descend from trains and automobiles to take flight, tracing a path from obscure speeches in crowded beer halls to commanding attention in stadiums that seemed to stretch endlessly. Each journey carried him into the intimate workings of a movement that was both charismatic and terrifying. In the air, Hitler shared little about his plans, but Baur could see it in the set of his jaw, the tension in his posture, and the way he studied the horizon with unyielding scrutiny. Every rally attended, every meeting reached, deepened the pilot's understanding. Proximity gave perspective, and perspective revealed danger. Trust between pilot and passenger deepened with every mile. Baur learned to read subtle cues. A sudden grip on the armrest signaling nervous anticipation. A silent sigh that carried disappointment or frustration. The tiny adjustments in seat posture that hinted at fear. Hitler's dependence on him was not just practical. It was existential. He feared assassination attempts, mechanical failure, and the unknown that lay beyond clouds. Yet, with Baur at the controls, he allowed himself to relinquish control, if only for the duration of each flight. The cockpit became a sanctuary of a peculiar kind, where fear was acknowledged but temporarily contained, where life and loyalty intertwined. As the Reich expanded, so too did the responsibilities of its pilot. Baur found himself navigating not just the geography of Germany, but the treacherous currents of politics and ambition. Each flight could carry Hitler into a city poised for political maneuvering or into a secret meeting with allies whose motives were obscured by decorum and secrecy. Baur's role remained strictly defined. Keep the man alive, deliver him safely. But the intimacy of those moments was undeniable. He saw how Hitler weighed decisions in private, how charisma could mask insecurity, and how every act of faith extended beyond mere ideology into the personal. Even in moments of routine, the dynamic was palpable. When turbulence struck, Baur felt the taut tension of the man in the co-pilot seat, the way fingers gripped straps or notes for reassurance. And every time the aircraft touched down safely, a quiet acknowledgement passed between them. a mutual recognition that survival depended on skill, courage, and an unspoken bond. Outside, the world roared with politics, propaganda, and the rise of a regime. Inside, it was just a pilot, a passenger, and the fragile machine of human trust suspended between sky and earth. In retrospect, Baur realized that Hitler's reliance on him was both a gift and a burden. The pilot did not crave power, nor did he seek recognition, but he understood the enormity of his responsibility. Loyalty, in this case, was a currency more valuable than gold, a fragile thread that held together not just a flight, but a man whose influence could shape history. And in every takeoff and landing, every journey across Germany's changing landscape, Baur discovered that proximity to power was a dangerous intimacy, one that demanded skill, discretion, and the quiet courage to remain a witness to both greatness and folly. By the mid-1930s, as the world watched a nation rise with both awe and fear, Hans Baur understood that his place was singular. He did not issue orders, nor did he shape policy, yet the man in the seat beside him relied on him utterly. And in that reliance lay a truth that would endure through war and ruin. Sometimes the deepest loyalty is invisible, and the lives of millions can hinge on the hands of one steady pilot who commands only an airplane, but carries far more than that in the hearts of those who depend on him. October 21st, the engines roared to life, drowning out the chatter of aides and the distant hum of the city below. In the cramped cockpit, the vibration thrummed through Hans Baur's bones, steady and predictable, an anchor against the chaos of the world beyond. Hitler settled into the seat beside him, eyes narrowed on the horizon, lips moving in a half-whisper that carried only to Baur. Out here, above the forests and rivers, above the prying eyes of the press and party officials, the Führer's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. He spoke in fragments at first, muttering about strategy, about the threats he imagined lurking behind every border. "They do not understand," he said, voice low and tight. "The world is blind to what Germany deserves. They think we are weak, and weakness invites destruction." Baur kept his hands firm on the controls, listening without judgment. Every word was a fragment of thought, a glimpse of the man behind the legend. The myth that the public consumed, the charismatic, commanding leader, was stripped away in the cockpit, leaving only obsession, paranoia, and an almost childlike need for control. The flights had become a stage of confession. Hitler spoke freely when the engines drowned out the world, when no eyes could gauge his expression and no pens could capture his half-formed plans. He spoke of Jews and communists with a venom that made Baur's stomach tighten, of generals whose loyalty he distrusted, of allies whose promises were thin. Occasionally, he laughed softly at his own cunning, but the laughter carried no warmth. It was the sound of a mind at war with itself. And through it all, Baur's role was simple yet profound. To steer, to listen, to survive. Baur began to notice patterns, subtle shifts that revealed the man's true nature. He would pace in the seat before takeoff, tapping fingers nervously against the armrest, then stiffen into rigid posture once airborne. When discussing plans, his eyes darted constantly, calculating potential betrayals, imagining enemies where there were none. Yet, paradoxically, this same man entrusted his life to a single pilot, depending on Baur's steadiness to navigate not only the skies but the dangerous currents of his own fears. Every flight was a negotiation of trust, a delicate balance between the pilot's skill and the passenger's compulsions. In these private moments, Hitler revealed a side history would rarely record. He spoke of Germany's destiny as if it were a living entity, capable of sensing insult or admiration, a nation that demanded obedience and punishment in equal measure. He admitted doubts, rare, fleeting, but they came with the same intensity as his certainties. "If we fail," he muttered once over the snow-capped Alps, "everything will burn, and the world will remember only our weakness." Baur felt the weight of those words, not as propaganda, but as a tangible tension pressing against the walls of the small cockpit. It was in this intimacy that Baur began to understand the machinery of power. Outside, speeches and rallies crafted the image of a leader in control. Inside, paranoia and obsession drove every action. The difference between public and private Hitler was stark. One inspired awe, the other commanded fear, even of his own shadows. Baur heard confidences that never reached diaries, never became transcripts. Plans for operations that would devastate nations. Reprimands whispered to generals. Subtle threats to those who dared question him. All laid bare in the hum of the engine and the cold air that whistled past the fuselage. And yet, Baur also saw vulnerability. Hitler's hands sometimes trembled as he adjusted instruments or unrolled maps, a subtle betrayal of his carefully curated persona. At night, during longer flights, he would sit quietly, staring out at the black expanse, lost in thought. He was ideologically fearless, yet humanly fragile. The pilot began to realize that power, even absolute power, relied on invisible hands, on the competence and discretion of those who served faithfully. It was a paradox. The world feared him, but he feared the sky, feared betrayal, and in some quiet moments, feared the emptiness of his own decisions. By the end of the flight, Baur had returned Hitler safely to the airfield, engines winding down, the roar fading into silence. The man emerged to greet party officials with his usual theatrical charisma, a mask of certainty and strength. But in the cockpit, the truth lingered. The myth was fractured, if only for the pilot who had been closest to him for 16 years. Power, Baur understood, was not always visible in speeches or rallies. Sometimes it hid in fear, in obsession, in the whispers of a man who trusted no one but the hands steady on the controls beside him. In that space, behind the curtain of engines and clouds, Hans Baur learned the most dangerous lesson of all. Proximity to power does not reveal heroism or wisdom. It reveals humanity, often flawed, sometimes terrifying, and always dependent on others. And as he climbed out of the cockpit, legs stiff from hours of vigilance, Baur felt the quiet weight of history pressing upon him, aware that what he had witnessed would never fully be told, yet had shaped the course of nations nonetheless. September 1st, the sky over Poland stretched wide and indifferent, pale blue streaked with wisps of cloud. Hans Baur gripped the controls of the Messerschmitt as Hitler leaned forward, eyes fixed on the ground far below, his face alight with the fevered certainty that had propelled Germany to this moment. From the air, the movements of armies, the precision of logistics, and the sweep of territory seemed almost clean. Lines were straight, objectives clear, flags marked positions, and the world below obeyed as if it were a map, obedient to the will of one man. Baur, as always, remained silent, observing both the terrain and the passenger beside him. In the cockpit, the engine's drone masked conversation, giving Hitler the freedom to speak as he rarely did elsewhere. "The world does not comprehend," he said, voice low but intense, "the inevitability of our rise. Every city, every fort, every border we take is destiny unfolding." There was triumph in his eyes, the same unyielding belief that had carried him from Munich to Nuremberg, and now into the airspace of another nation. The Reich was ascending, and he felt it in every fiber of his being. Flying over the advancing columns of tanks, the neat formations of infantry, and the smoke curling from initial skirmishes, Baur felt a strange mixture of awe and unease. From above, the conquest looked orderly, almost poetic. The streets below were like a chessboard, each move deliberate, each outcome calculated. But as a pilot trained to read patterns and anticipate danger, Baur also saw the shadows that maps could not capture. The panic in townspeople fleeing, the fires left unattended, the chaos that would ripple across lives for years to come. Victory appeared pristine only when viewed from a safe height. The early weeks of the war were a testament to confidence. The Luftwaffe sweeping the skies, Germany's military machine executing maneuvers with machine-like precision, and Hitler's satisfaction growing with each successful advance. Flights to command centers, inspection points, and meetings with generals became routine, yet routine did not lessen the weight of responsibility. Each journey was still a gamble. One misjudged maneuver, one miscommunication, and the man who had become the embodiment of the Reich's destiny could die. And with him, the momentum of history could falter. Baur watched Hitler in these moments as closely as he watched the horizon. He noted the intensity of his observations, the sharpness with which he questioned officers, the meticulous attention to reports, maps, and aerial photographs. Here, in the sky, removed from the ceremonial pomp of rallies and public appearances, Hitler's genius and his obsession was most visible. He was exacting, almost obsessive in detail, yet utterly convinced that the outcomes he demanded were inevitable. He spoke of strategies as if they were moral imperatives, of victories as if they were inevitable proofs of destiny. Baur remained the steady hand guiding the aircraft, silent but fully aware of the enormity of the stage unfolding beneath them. Yet even in triumph, the pilot could not ignore reality. From above, Baur glimpsed the human cost that no map could convey. Columns of refugees stretched along country roads, villages half consumed by fire, and the silent dread of those caught between advancing armies and retreating defenders. The world that looked so ordered from the cockpit was, in fact, fracturing beneath them. And still, Hitler's voice carried on, fearless and insistent, describing tactical brilliance, ideological inevitability, and the inexorable momentum of the Reich. To him, what Baur saw as suffering was merely collateral in the theater of destiny. Flying over conquered territories, Baur sensed a dissonance he could not articulate aloud. Triumph and horror existed simultaneously, juxtaposed in a way that only distance, literal and moral, could conceal. The pilot carried the Führer from one locus of command to another, observing history accelerate with every turn, every climb, every descent. He realized that the spectacle of victory, the parades, the flags, the reports of efficiency, was a veneer. Beneath it lay chaos, fear, and an unfolding tragedy that would eventually claim millions. Yet that was invisible from the cockpit, and Baur's role demanded that he focus on what he could control: the flight, the engines, and the life in the seat beside him. By the time the Focke-Wulf touched down on Polish soil, Hitler emerged with the same energy and confidence he had carried throughout the ascent. Orders were given, generals consulted, and plans for further expansion discussed. Yet Baur remained in the background, the invisible witness to a world both orchestrated and unmade by ambition. He understood, as he had for years, that power looked different from above. Clean, decisive, inevitable. But history, as he also knew, was never so tidy on the ground. The human cost, the fear, the destruction, all would ripple beyond maps, beyond photographs, and beyond the narratives Hitler wished the world to see. And as Baur climbed out of the cockpit, engine still humming in his ears, he felt that familiar weight, the knowledge that he had survived countless flights, that he had seen the Reich at its height, and that proximity to greatness was inseparable from the burden of witnessing its dark truths. From the air, victory looked immaculate. On the ground, it never was. By January 1943, the winter air stung Baur's face as he taxied the Focke-Wulf along a frozen airstrip near the Eastern Front. Snow lay thick on the ground, and the sky above was a pale, unyielding gray. Inside the cockpit, Hitler sat rigid, eyes darting over maps with a tremor that had begun to betray him more with each passing year. His hands, once steady as a surgeon's, now quivered when adjusting dials or holding the charts. Baur noticed the subtle shaking at first only because he had flown him for over a decade. For those not accustomed, it might have gone unseen. But the tremor was more than physical. It was a symptom of an unraveling mind, a body and psyche burdened by ambition, defeat, and relentless obsession. Flights that had once seemed routine had grown perilous. Routes were constantly changed to avoid Soviet fighters or partisans, airstrips were damaged or unreachable, and winter storms shredded plans with terrifying unpredictability. Hitler's insistence on personally visiting front lines, inspecting troops, and attending high-level meetings meant that Baur had to navigate skies increasingly crowded with danger. Each takeoff carried a tension heavier than any previous year. The cockpit no longer felt like a sanctuary but a crucible where every decision could spell disaster. Hitler's mood had darkened along with the skies. He raged at generals for what he perceived as incompetence, berated staff for delays, and muttered about betrayal with a venom that was equal parts paranoia and genuine conviction. He clung to magical thinking, assigning mystical significance to victories and losses alike. Baur remembered one flight over the snow-swept plains of Russia when Hitler leaned close, whispering about omens in the weather and the stars, insisting that destiny had chosen Germany but that forces beyond human comprehension were working to thwart it. The pilot said nothing, hands steady on the controls, though the words left a chill in his mind. The physical decline mirrored the mental strain. Hitler grew gaunt, his skin pale beneath the thick uniforms he refused to abandon, lips cracked from the dry winter air and long hours of speech and thought. Tremors were noticeable not only in his hands but in his jaw and his posture, particularly during tense meetings aboard the plane. He would sometimes sit in silence for long stretches, staring blankly out of the cockpit window, and Baur knew those moments carried the weight of both reflection and dread. For all the talk of destiny and inevitability, the Führer was human, and the human body had limits, even when ideology attempted to mask them. By 1943, cracks had appeared in the Reich itself, and flights reflected the change. Airstrips near front lines were makeshift, fuel was rationed, and Soviet aircraft contested the skies more aggressively. Convoys had been ambushed, and the winter had made terrain treacherous. Even minor miscalculations could mean death. Baur navigated these conditions with meticulous precision, aware that the man beside him still believed in his own omnipotence, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge that the world had begun to fight back. The tension in the cockpit was palpable. One wrong turn, one misjudged approach, and the fragile bubble of confidence would shatter. Hitler's behavior became more volatile. He erupted in anger over missed reports, shouted at aides for trivial lapses, and sometimes demanded immediate action on fantasies of retaliation that were impossible to execute. Baur learned to read the signs. A tightening of the jaw, a clenching of fists, a flicker in the eye that signaled an imminent outburst. The pilot's role became both more critical and more perilous. He had to navigate the skies while simultaneously managing the passenger's temperament, ensuring that a fit of rage did not result in a catastrophic error. And yet, despite the tension, the Führer still relied utterly on Baur's hands. Trust did not waver, even as physical decline made every flight more dangerous. Baur carried him through snowstorms, across mine territories, and over contested airspace, fully aware that the man's faith in his own destiny was matched only by his faith in the pilot who had borne him safely for years. The cockpit remained the only place where Hitler could be himself, unguarded, unobserved, human, but now that humanity was marked by desperation as much as ambition. Baur noticed small, telling details. The way Hitler's voice quivered during extended explanations, how he chewed on the edge of maps when frustrated, how his gaze would linger on ruined cities below, unseeing yet full of imagined threats. The pilot began to sense that the Führer's grip on reality was loosening, replaced by superstition, obsession, and increasingly reckless confidence. Flights that had once been exercises in skill and discretion were now fraught with tension so thick that even Baur's practiced hands could feel it pressing against the controls. By mid-1943, the pattern was unmistakable. Victory was no longer assured. The world had pushed back. Stalingrad burned like a warning beneath them, and reports of losses poured in with a relentless rhythm. Hitler's speeches spoke of triumph, but the tremors in his hands and the wild look in his eyes told a different story. The Reich's ascent had slowed, its edges fraying under the weight of reality, and the cockpit, the one place where Baur and the Führer were alone, had become a silent witness to the collapse that would follow. Even as the snow swirled and engines hummed, Baur understood the bitter truth. Power, no matter how absolute it appeared, was not immune to gravity. The Führer, who had once soared above nations with confidence, now seemed suspended precariously in the air, both physically and metaphorically. Each flight was a negotiation between skill and fate, ambition and mortality, and the pilot realized that proximity to such power was not honor, it was a burden. Survival required discipline, discretion, and an acceptance of the darkness that accompanied obedience. And so, with every takeoff into the bitter winter sky, Hans Baur flew not just for the Reich, but for the fragile life of the man who had come to define it. The engines roared, masking the tremors, the obsessions, and the quiet desperation of a Führer who could feel gravity pulling him down, yet still demanded to fly. The world below may have been unraveling, but above it, in the cockpit, one pilot remained the invisible hand keeping history from tipping into the unknown. By April 1945, the sky above Berlin was a slate of smoke and fire. Anti-aircraft shells streaked upward like brittle lightning, punctuating the roar of artillery below. Hans Baur's hands were steady on the Focke-Wulf's controls, though the tension knotted every muscle in his body. The Reich he had flown over for more than a decade was unraveling. Cities burning, streets reduced to rubble, and the man he had carried through triumph and tragedy now clinging desperately to life and illusion. The cockpit was his domain, the only space where he could contain the chaos, even as the world around him fell apart. Hitler sat rigid beside him, lips drawn, eyes hollow but sharp with fury. Tremors ran through his hands more violently than ever, and the commander of a collapsing empire barked orders as if the sky itself might respond. Baur could feel the desperation pressing from every direction, military, political, moral, and he understood with chilling clarity that loyalty had become more than a duty. It was a test, a moral crucible. For years, Baur had considered himself a professional first, a pilot who obeyed orders and carried his passengers safely, keeping politics and ideology at arm's length. He had flown Hitler through victories and setbacks alike, believing that by remaining apolitical, he preserved his humanity while safeguarding life. Yet now, in the final weeks of the Reich, the boundary between professionalism and complicity felt impossibly thin. Each flight carried the weight of history. Each maneuver, each landing, was an act of participation in a regime's final, desperate fury. He remembered earlier flights before the collapse when he could compartmentalize. Flying over conquered cities, he could admire the precision of strategy, even as he glimpsed the chaos beneath. Hitler's demands had been absolute, but the pilot's conscience had been shielded by routine, by distance, by the hum of engines that drowned out screams and political machinations alike. Yet here, as Berlin burned, shields of distance and professionalism fractured. The orders were no longer abstract. They were directives issued in extremis, guiding a man toward inevitable death, dragging the Reich's remnants toward ruin. The cockpit was both sanctuary and prison. Hitler leaned close, muttering fragmented plans, speaking of vengeance and of destiny with fevered conviction. Baur obeyed, as he always had, navigating through a gauntlet of anti-aircraft fire and the narrow alleys of a city under siege. The engines drowned out much of the chaos, but not the gravity of what he was doing. He was not ideologically bound, but he could not deny his role. By flying the Führer, by keeping him alive even briefly, he enabled his obsessions to persist, enabled a man whose ambitions had destroyed millions to continue directing destruction from a cockpit and a map. Self-image as a professional had become a fragile shield. Baur had trained himself to view obedience as neutrality, competence as moral insulation. Yet, in the final days, the line blurred. The cockpit no longer felt like a neutral space but a stage of complicity. Every successful landing preserved the life of a man responsible for countless atrocities. Every decision he made to fly, to navigate, to keep calm, was itself a decision to continue history under a shadow he could no longer ignore. Still, he acted. Survival, both his own and that of his passenger, demanded focus. He guided the aircraft with precision, anticipating threats, adjusting for fires on the airfield, dodging debris and fragments from shells that turned the sky into a deadly obstacle course. Obedience and skill had never felt heavier. The engine's roar, once a comforting hum, now seemed a judge's gavel, measuring loyalty against morality. Baur understood that history would not remember his caution, his professionalism, or his compartmentalization. It would only see the result, that he had carried a man who had unleashed terror across nations to the very end. The moral tension was constant, inescapable. He had flown Hitler over rallies where adoration masked fear, over conquered territories where order hid suffering, over front lines where the cost of ambition was human lives. And now, as the Reich collapsed in flames, the pilot understood that loyalty, even professional loyalty, had its price. Obedience was no longer neutral. It had become a participation in inevitability. The cockpit, once a place of focus and skill, had become a crucible of judgment, both external and internal. Yet Baur's gaze remained outward, hands steady, mind calculating. He had trained for precision, for survival, for the life of the passenger entrusted to him. He understood that in the fog of war, and in the collapse of empire, actions could not always be separated from consequence. The lines between professionalism, morality, and complicity were blurred, tangled in the smoke of bombed-out streets, the screams of civilians, and the tremor in the Führer's voice. Every flight carried the tension of history itself, the weight of decisions he had never made, and the realization that survival did not absolve, it only prolonged witnessing. By the end of each day, as engines cooled and the airstrip disappeared beneath layers of smoke and rubble, Baur felt the burden acutely. He had remained neutral in ideology, professional in skill, but neutrality in the face of immense evil is a fragile shield. It shields only from perception, not from truth. In the cockpit, in the sky above a crumbling Reich, he understood that competence could not erase moral tension. Obedience had carried him far, but now it carried history itself, in every tremor of the man beside him, in every echo of destruction below. And so, with the smoke rising and Berlin's ruins stretching into the horizon, Hans Baur continued to fly. He remained the invisible hand guiding the Führer, the professional who had mastered skies and engines alike. Yet he also carried something heavier, the weight of knowledge, the witness of complicity, and the unanswerable question that would follow him long after the last flight. At what point does obedience stop being neutral and become participation in history's darkest chapters? By 1945, the streets above were unrecognizable. Berlin was a ruin of rubble, smoke, and gunfire, but Hans Baur felt more trapped beneath the surface than anywhere he had ever flown. The Führer bunker was a claustrophobic maze of concrete, its air thick with the smell of coal, sweat, and despair. Here, orders were issued not to shape destiny, but to cling to the illusion that it still existed. Hitler moved through the corridors with the same rigid precision he had once commanded in grand halls. But now his steps echoed against walls that offered no audience, no grandeur, only the weight of reality pressing from every direction. Inside, fantasy and delusion intermingled. Hitler consulted maps that no longer mattered, imagined armies advancing where there were none, and received reports filtered by fear and panic. His inner circle shrank with every hour, generals and ministers leaving or dying, leaving only the loyal, the frightened, and the uselessly optimistic. Baur watched him obsess over details that no longer affected the war's outcome. Which sectors to defend, which bridges to hold, how best to maintain morale among a population that had already fled or perished. Each decision was ceremonial, each command an echo, and yet Hitler clung to control as if the bunker itself could preserve the Reich. The atmosphere was suffocating. Confined spaces amplified paranoia. The air buzzed with whispered rumors, frantic scribbles on maps, and the nervous shuffling of aides. Baur, once a participant in the grand theater of power, now found himself an observer of its final act. He witnessed Hitler's increasing obsession with apocalyptic visions, his late-night interrogations, and the strange, intimate moments that humanized yet horrified. Marriage to Eva Braun was celebrated quietly in a room that once hosted strategic meetings, a surreal juxtaposition of private life against the backdrop of national ruin. The Führer's isolation was complete. The world above had crumbled, and below, he clung to delusions as desperately as a child clings to a toy in a storm. Baur moved carefully, avoiding confrontation, fulfilling his duties while keeping a careful distance. He witnessed the psychological collapse in real time. Tremors, fits of rage, whispered soliloquies about betrayal, and frantic attempts to maintain appearances for the few who remained. The bunker had become a theater of desperation, a mausoleum of empire, and Hans Baur understood that survival now meant restraint, discretion, and quiet observation. Each glance, each flight plan he had ever executed, seemed insignificant compared to the moral and human weight contained in these subterranean halls. By April 30th, there was no escape flight this time. No engines roared to cover panic, no altitudes to give perspective. Silence reigned. Baur watched from a distance as the last semblance of the Reich's command disintegrated in the dim corridors. Hitler, finally acknowledging that destiny had failed, retreated into a private room with Eva Braun. Moments later, the soundless conclusion arrived. A gunshot, the shattering of ideology, and the silence that followed. Orders were given and ignored in chaotic succession. Aides hesitated, loyalists questioned, soldiers deserted. Bodies were burned in the small courtyard, a futile attempt at control even in death. Outside, the city burned, the world encroached, yet the bunker remained a tomb of illusion. Hans Baur's role had changed. He was no longer the man responsible for flight, for transporting a passenger across skies of conquest and despair. Now his task was simple: survive. He moved cautiously among the few who remained, avoiding unnecessary attention, observing the disintegration of what had once seemed invincible. Fear was tangible, almost physical, pressing against every wall, every corner. The Reich did not end with banners flying or parades. It ended in fire, in confusion, in panic. And yet Baur carried the weight of proximity, having been witness to both the rise and the fall, and understanding that history often remembered the powerful and forgot the hands that held them aloft, and sometimes bore them safely, even to the very end. Hans Baur fled the bunker in the chaos, moving through streets scarred with destruction. He was wounded, small shards from collapsed buildings and gunfire, and the winter air bit at exposed skin. Soviet troops were everywhere, their presence immediate and overwhelming. Escape was impossible. Within hours, he was captured. What followed was a different kind of endurance. 10 years of imprisonment, interrogation, and isolation reshaped him. The Soviets sought truth, demanded confessions, and probed memories with relentless intensity. They extracted details of flights, meetings, and secrets he had carried in silence for years. Baur spoke cautiously, recounting what was necessary, omitting what could bring greater consequences. Memory became both weapon and shield. Every recollection balanced between survival and the moral weight of revelation. In captivity, Baur confronted questions he had long avoided. How had loyalty intersected with evil? Could obedience ever be neutral? Every flight, every mission, every moment spent ferrying Hitler and witnessing power's intimate workings replayed in his mind. Yet survival demanded pragmatism. He realized that history would judge him for proximity, for participation, and for witnessing, but that he could shape what remained of his narrative through discretion and endurance. By 1955, after a decade of captivity, Baur was released. The world outside had changed. Germany was fractured, the Reich a memory, and the skies he had mastered now belonged to a new era. He walked free, yet not unburdened. Memory remained sharp, moral tension unresolved, and the lessons of the cockpit, the bunker, and survival burned into him. History had passed, yet he carried it, silent and unflinching, understanding the complex truth. Proximity to power is both gift and curse, and surviving the fall of a world requires more than skill. It demands conscience tempered by discretion, and the courage to witness without participating more than fate allows. By 1965, the world had moved on, but Hans Baur had not. Decades after the bunker, after the flights, after the war ended and the Reich crumbled, he sat in quiet rooms, recounting memories that were at once intimate and terrifying. Memoirs were drafted carefully, words measured, confessions precise, omissions deliberate. He confirmed what the world wanted to know. Hitler had died in the bunker, as the history books claimed. But the rest, that belonged to shadows, to the space between duty and conscience, to the cockpit where no one else could hear the truth. Controversy followed him like a shadow. Some called him a loyal servant, a professional who survived by doing only what was asked. Others whispered, implied, or outright accused him of complicity. Could one be neutral in the presence of such evil? Could a life spent following orders, flying one man through victory and ruin, be morally exonerated by technical skill alone? Baur offered no simple answers. He had survived, yes, and in surviving he had carried both witness and burden. The memoirs were careful, almost clinical, recounting flights over Poland, France, and the collapsing Reich, the roar of engines masking the tremors, obsessions, and outbursts of a man who had reshaped the world through ideology and terror. Baur avoided the sensational, avoided claiming heroism, avoided explaining what he could not. He focused on precision, on the mechanics of flight, on the fragile trust that had kept Hitler alive. He described proximity to power without claiming mastery over it. And yet, for all the factual clarity, the moral question lingered. Standing close to power, surviving the collapse, telling the truth selectively, was that enough? Could one witness history's darkest chapters without participating fully, yet still bear responsibility simply for being there? Baur left these questions unresolved, letting them hover over his account, letting them echo in the minds of readers, historians, and listeners alike. In the end, his verdict was neither absolution nor condemnation. He was not a monster, though he had flown the monster. He was not a hero, though he had endured heroically by skill and luck. He was something far more unsettling. A man who did his job perfectly, who stayed close to power, who never intervened directly, and yet could not escape the consequences of proximity.